Hello, my dear friend. Today I'm sharing my story about learning English while traveling. Before we dive into the story, let me explain the idea behind it. Learning English through travel can be an exciting and effective way to improve language skills. The story highlights how one can practice speaking, listening, and even thinking in English by interacting with new people and cultures while on the move. In this story, Alex embarks on a journey where he not only explores new places but also advances his English skills. You'll see how Alex faces different situations, from ordering food to asking for directions, all while improving his confidence in speaking English. This method combines practical use of the language with real-life experiences, making learning fun and memorable. Now, let's start the story. Hi, my name is Alex, and today I'm sharing something really exciting. It's not just about traveling to new places, but also about how I use that experience to learn English. I've always been curious about the world, wanting to see different cultures, try new food, and meet people from all walks of life. But for a long time, there was one thing that held me back: my English. Sure, I understood English from school and videos, but speaking? That was a whole different story. I couldn't form sentences as quickly as I wanted, and sometimes I felt shy and anxious about making mistakes. My journey to improve English started when I decided to travel, not just to see the world, but to use those experiences to practice speaking English. So, let me take you with me as I go on this trip and learn along the way. The Airport Adventure. It all started when I had to catch a flight to London. I was really excited, but also a little nervous. I mean, I would have to speak English the moment I reached the airport. The first test came at the check-in counter. "Hi, I'd like to check in for my flight to London," I said, trying to sound confident. The lady behind the counter smiled, and for a second I relaxed. She asked me something I didn't quite understand at first. "Would you like an aisle or a window seat?" she asked. I froze for a second. The words aisle and window seemed like a blur in my head, but then I took a deep breath. I quickly processed what she was asking and replied, "Window, please." I realized that I didn't need to panic. I could figure things out by context if I just gave myself a moment. As I waited for my flight, I realized how being in a real-life situation like this helped me think in English. It wasn't about memorizing grammar rules anymore. It was about using English to get through real-world situations. Conversations on the plane. On the flight, I had a window seat just like I asked, and beside me was a man who seemed friendly. After we took off, he turned to me and said, "So, are you traveling for work or pleasure?" I paused for a moment to think about how to respond. This was a great chance to practice speaking, and I didn't want to miss it. "I'm traveling for pleasure. I'm visiting London for the first time," I replied, trying to sound as smooth as possible. We ended up talking for the rest of the flight. He was from Canada and shared a lot about his travels. The more I spoke with him, the more confident I became. I realized that speaking English wasn't as scary as I had thought. It was all about practice and getting used to forming sentences without overthinking every word. Ordering food. My first real test. When I landed in London, I was super hungry. The plane food wasn't great, so the first thing I did after checking into my hotel was find a place to eat. There was this cozy cafe right around the corner. I walked in and the smell of fresh bread hit me. Perfect. I walked up to the counter, ready to place my order, but suddenly I felt a little anxious. I knew what I wanted, but I wasn't sure how to say it. The menu had all these new words that I wasn't familiar with. The lady behind the counter smiled and asked, "What can I get for you today?" I stumbled for a second, but quickly gathered myself. "I'd like a sandwich with ham and cheese, please," I said, hoping I got it right. "Do you want it toasted?" she asked. "Yes, toasted, please," I replied, feeling a small victory in my heart. I managed to order food in English without any major mistakes. It felt good, and it boosted my confidence even more. Navigating the city. During my trip, I had to ask for directions several times, and every time I learned a new phrase or expression. One day, I needed to find a museum I had read about online. I stopped by a tourist information desk and asked, "Excuse me, can you tell me how to get to the British Museum?" The lady at the desk smiled and gave me directions, using words like "turn left" and "go straight ahead." I had to pay close attention because, let's face it, I wasn't used to all these directions in English. But by repeating them in my head and asking a follow-up question when I wasn't sure, I managed to get to the museum without getting lost. I learned that when you're traveling, it's okay to ask people to repeat themselves or to clarify if you didn't understand the first time. Most people are more than willing to help, especially when they see you're trying. Meeting new people. One of the best parts about traveling is meeting new people. I stayed in a hostel for a few days, and there were travelers from all over the world. In the common room, I met a guy named Jack from Australia and a girl named Maria from Spain. We talked every evening, sharing stories about our travels. Jack spoke fast, and sometimes I had to ask him to slow down or explain a word. But Maria, who was also learning English, and I connected really well. We would help each other with vocabulary and pronunciation. It felt good knowing I wasn't the only one learning English while traveling. Learning on the go, I realized that traveling is like being in a giant classroom. You learn so much from the people you meet, the signs you read, and the places you visit. I even picked up new phrases from overhearing conversations in restaurants and shops. And every day, my English improved just a little more. But it wasn't just about improving my language skills. Traveling helped me understand the importance of communication beyond just the words. It's about body language, tone, and even the courage to speak up, even when you're not sure if you're getting it all right. Trying local experiences. After spending a few days in London, I felt more confident. So I decided to challenge myself even more by visiting smaller towns, where I could interact with people who might not speak as much English with foreign accents, unlike the international crowd in London. I took a train to a small town called Bath, known for its ancient Roman baths and beautiful Georgian architecture. This place was a bit quieter, and I felt like I could slow down and practice even more. On my first day there, I walked into a little bakery that looked like it had been around for centuries. "Hello," I greeted the elderly woman behind the counter. She smiled warmly and asked, "What can I get for you, dear?" Now, this is where I hit a bit of a wall. The baked goods on display were all labeled with names I had never seen before. I wanted to try something new, but I had no idea what they were. Instead of just pointing, I figured this was another chance to practice. Could you tell me what this one is?" I asked, pointing to a round golden pastry. "Ah, that's a traditional bath bun," she explained. "It's sweet and filled with sugar and currants. It's quite famous around here." I nodded and smiled, taking mental notes of the new words she used. "I'll take one of those, please." As I enjoyed my bath bun, I realized that the more I engaged with locals, the more new words and expressions I picked up. It wasn't just about ordering food anymore. It was about learning the local culture and language through these small interactions. Asking for recommendations. Later that day, I decided to explore the town and visit the famous Roman baths. I could have just followed a map, but I wanted to push myself further. So, I asked a man working at a souvenir shop for recommendations. "Excuse me," I said, approaching him. "I'm visiting Bath for the first time. What places do you recommend I see?" He smiled and leaned in as if he had a secret to share. "Well, you've got to see the Roman baths, of course. But if you're interested in history, there's also the Jane Austen Center. And if you like walks, there's a beautiful hike up to Alexandra Park. It gives you the best view of the town." "That sounds great," I said, excited by the idea of exploring more than just the famous sites. "Could you tell me how to get to the park?" "Sure. You go down this street, turn left at the corner cafe, and follow the signs for Alexandra Park. It's a bit of a climb, but it's worth it." I thanked him and headed off, proud of how I had managed to ask for directions and even get a local's perspective on hidden gems. These conversations were becoming easier each day, and I realized that I was thinking more in English without translating everything in my head first. A funny misunderstanding. Of course, not everything went smoothly. There was one moment that, looking back, makes me laugh. While visiting a local pub, I wanted to try some traditional British food, and I noticed a dish called toad in the hole on the menu. It sounded strange, but I figured, why not? When the waiter came to take my order, I confidently said, "I'll have the toad in the hole, please." He smiled and asked, "Would you like mash with that?" I blinked, confused. "Mash?" I repeated, trying to figure out what he meant. My mind immediately went to mashed potatoes, but I wasn't sure. "Yes, mashed potatoes," he clarified with a friendly grin. "It's a popular side dish with toad in the hole." I nodded quickly. "Yes, mash sounds great." Later, when the dish arrived, I learned that toad in the hole wasn't some exotic dish involving frogs, as I had briefly worried, but sausages baked in Yorkshire pudding, and the mash was indeed mashed potatoes. It was a funny moment, but one that reminded me that making mistakes is part of learning. And hey, I got to enjoy some delicious food in the process. Navigating challenges. Not everything was fun and games, though. One afternoon, I decided to take a bus to a nearby village. I was excited to visit, but when I got on the bus, I realized I had no idea how the local buses worked. Do I pay the driver when I get on, or do I need to buy a ticket in advance? The bus driver looked at me as I hesitated at the entrance. "Where are you headed, mate?" he asked in his thick British accent. I stammered a bit before replying, "I'm going to Castle Combe." "Do I, um, do I buy the ticket here?" He nodded and said, "Yes, just tell me where you're going, and I'll give you the fare." I managed to pay and find a seat, but the experience taught me something important. It's okay to not know everything right away. The key is to stay calm, ask questions, and learn from every situation. Language through experience. As my travels continued, I realized something profound. The best way to learn English wasn't just through textbooks or language apps. It was through experiences. Every time I asked for directions, ordered food, or chatted with someone at a cafe, I was learning. Not just the language, but how to communicate, how to express myself more clearly, and how to be okay with making mistakes. One day, while sitting in a park, I reflected on how far I had come. Just a few weeks ago, I would have felt too nervous to ask a stranger for directions. Now, I could hold entire conversations without overthinking every word. It wasn't about being perfect, it was about being understood. A conversation with locals. On my last evening in Bath, I sat in a small pub where locals gathered for a quiz night. I hadn't planned on participating, but a group of friendly locals invited me to join their team. It was the perfect opportunity to practice even more English. The quiz master read out questions, and our team huddled together to discuss the answers. I tried to contribute whenever I could, but more importantly, I listened. I listened to how they spoke, their casual expressions, and the way they played with words. At one point, we were stumped by a question about British pop music, and I jokingly said, "I'll leave that one to you guys. I'm still catching up on all the British bands." The group laughed, and one of them said, "Don't worry, mate. You've been a great help. Your English is really good." That compliment stuck with me. It wasn't about whether my English was perfect. It was about the effort I put in and the progress I had made. By traveling and putting myself in situations where I had to use English, I had learned more than I ever could have in a classroom. Returning home, a new perspective. When my trip came to an end, I felt a mix of emotions. I had fallen in love with the places I had visited and the people I had met. But more than that, I was proud of how much my English had improved. Every conversation, every mistake, every new word I learned had been part of an incredible journey. As I boarded my flight home, I thought about how different this experience had been from simply studying English. Traveling had made the language come alive for me. It wasn't just words on a page anymore. It was a way to connect with people, to explore the world, and to understand new cultures. When the flight attendant asked me, "Would you like chicken or pasta for dinner?" I smiled and confidently replied, "Pasta, please." It was such a simple exchange, but it represented something much bigger to me. I had grown, not just as a traveler, but as a speaker of English. The journey home, reflecting on the lessons. As I settled into my seat for the long flight home, my mind was buzzing with all the experiences I had gathered. This trip had been about more than just sightseeing or tasting new foods. It had become an adventure in language learning. I had pushed myself in ways I hadn't expected, and every interaction had been a chance to sharpen my English skills. During the flight, I pulled out my notebook. You see, I had been jotting down new phrases, words, and even funny moments throughout my trip. It wasn't just about memorizing these words, but understanding how they fit into conversations and how they made communication smoother. I had filled several pages by now, but as I flipped through them, I realized that what I had truly gained couldn't be written down. Here are a few key lessons I learned from my travels. Confidence is key. In the beginning, I hesitated a lot, unsure of my speaking skills. I was worried about embarrassing myself or saying the wrong thing. But over time, I realized that the fear of making mistakes was holding me back more than the actual mistakes themselves. People were kind, patient, and even willing to help when I fumbled. Confidence in speaking wasn't about knowing every word. It was about having the courage to speak up. It's okay to ask for help. Whether I was asking for directions, clarification on a menu, or help understanding a word, I learned that people are usually happy to assist. In fact, asking for help opened up more opportunities for conversation. Each time I sought help, I found myself learning something new, whether it was a new phrase or even a bit of cultural insight. Don't be afraid to ask questions. You'll always come away with more knowledge than you had before. Immersive learning works. I couldn't count how many new words I picked up just by being in an English-speaking environment. In school or at home, learning English had been structured, with set lessons and vocabulary lists. But on this trip, learning was organic. It came from real conversations, experiences, and situations where I had no choice but to figure things out. This immersive learning made the language feel less like something I was studying and more like a tool I was using every day. Mistakes are part of the process. I had a few embarrassing moments, like ordering toad in the hole and not knowing what it was, or misunderstanding directions once and ending up at the wrong place. But each mistake was a learning opportunity. It made me laugh, and more importantly, it helped me remember the correct way next time. I realized that mistakes weren't failures. They were just steps on the path to getting better. Back home, a new confidence in English. When I arrived back home, everything felt familiar, but I knew that something inside me had changed. My mindset had shifted. English was no longer this intimidating challenge. It was something I could handle. The experiences I'd had while traveling gave me a whole new level of confidence. The first real test came when I met up with my friend Mark. He had always been better at speaking English than I was, and I used to feel a bit insecure about that. But this time, I didn't feel nervous. We were at our favorite cafe, and as we ordered food, I found myself speaking in English without even thinking too much about it. "Wow, Alex, your English has really improved," Mark said, sounding genuinely impressed. "What happened? You're speaking so fluently now." I smiled, proud of how far I'd come. "I guess it's because I had no choice," I said, laughing. "Traveling forced me to use English every day, and after a while it just became easier." Mark nodded. "That makes sense. Practice really does make perfect, huh?" "Exactly," I said. "But it's more than that. I think it's about putting yourself in situations where you have to speak, even if you're not ready. That's how you really learn." We spent the rest of the afternoon chatting, mostly in English. I noticed how natural the conversation felt. I wasn't translating words in my head anymore. I was thinking in English, responding in English, and enjoying the conversation without the usual stress. Sharing my story with others. A few weeks later, I was invited to give a talk at a local language learning group. They had heard about my trip and how it had helped me improve my English. I was a bit nervous at first. I wasn't used to speaking in front of groups, but I knew this was another opportunity to push myself. When I arrived at the event, the room was filled with people who were all in different stages of learning English. Some were beginners, while others were more advanced. As I looked around, I realized that just a few months ago, I would have felt the same way they did. Nervous, unsure, and maybe a little overwhelmed. But now, I had something valuable to share with them. "Hi, my name is Alex," I started, feeling a surge of confidence. "And today I want to tell you how traveling helped me learn English." I shared stories about my trip, from ordering food in London to getting lost in Bath, and how each experience had taught me something new. I emphasized that learning a language isn't just about sitting in a classroom. It's about using it in real life, making mistakes, and learning as you go. After my talk, several people came up to me to ask questions. Some wanted advice on how to get over their fear of speaking, while others were curious about traveling as a way to practice English. I was happy to share everything I had learned and to encourage them to keep going, no matter how difficult it seemed. The road ahead. Looking back on my journey, I realized that learning English had become more than just a goal. It had become a part of my life. The fear I once had about speaking had faded, replaced by excitement and curiosity. Traveling had opened my eyes to new cultures, new experiences, and new ways of thinking, and it had shown me that language is the key to unlocking all of that. But this wasn't the end of my journey. I knew there was still so much to learn, and I was excited to keep going. Maybe I'd travel to other countries, or maybe I'd continue practicing by joining local English-speaking groups. Whatever the path, I knew one thing for sure. I was no longer afraid of speaking English. So, my friend, if you're reading this and wondering how you can improve your English, my advice is simple. Take the leap. Put yourself in situations where you have to use English, even if it feels uncomfortable at first. Travel if you can, meet new people, and don't be afraid of making mistakes. Every conversation, every interaction is a chance to learn and grow. And remember, learning a language is a journey, not a destination. Enjoy the process, celebrate your progress, and most importantly, keep going. You never know where it might take you. Exploring a new country. Arrival in Japan. After my successful trip to England, I felt ready to take on another challenge. This time, I decided to go somewhere completely different. Japan. The idea of traveling to a country where English wasn't the primary language excited me. It was a whole new level of testing my skills. Not only would I be using English to communicate with people who might not be fluent, but I'd also have to adapt to an entirely different culture. When I landed in Tokyo, I could already feel the difference. The signs, the language, the atmosphere, everything was new and unfamiliar. But I was excited. I knew that many people in Japan spoke some English, especially in the bigger cities like Tokyo. But I also knew that this trip would force me to get creative with my communication. I checked into a small hotel near Shibuya, one of the busiest areas in the city. The hotel staff spoke some English, which made checking in a smooth process, but I could already tell that things would be a bit more challenging than they were in England. This wasn't just about learning English through conversations. It was about navigating a language barrier with what I already knew. First interaction at a local restaurant. After settling in, I was hungry, so I decided to head out and explore the neighborhood. I found a small local restaurant that looked inviting. It didn't seem like a place that catered to tourists, which was exactly what I wanted. I figured that pushing myself out of my comfort zone would help me grow even more. As I walked in, I was greeted by the hostess, who gave me a warm smile and said something in Japanese. I had no idea what she said, but I smiled back and responded, "Hi, table for one, please." She hesitated for a moment, then nodded and led me to a table. The menu was all in Japanese, but fortunately, there were pictures of the dishes. I scanned the menu, looking for something that looked interesting. Once the waiter came to take my order, I realized I was in for a challenge. He spoke very little English, and I didn't know enough Japanese to explain what I wanted in detail. Um, I'll have this one, I said, pointing to a dish on the menu. It looked like some kind of noodle soup, and I was eager to try it. The waiter nodded, but then asked me something in Japanese. I had no idea what he was saying, but his gesture suggested he was asking a question about the dish, probably asking if I wanted a specific ingredient or a different version of the dish. I paused, smiled, and said, "Could you explain in English?" He thought for a moment, then said slowly, "Spicy or no spicy?" Ah, that was it. I smiled back, relieved. Not spicy, please, I said. This simple exchange made me realize how much I relied on nonverbal cues and context when speaking English in a non-English speaking country. Even though the conversation was minimal, I had managed to communicate successfully. And when the food arrived, it was delicious. A steaming bowl of ramen, just the way I wanted it. Asking for directions. The next day, I decided to visit a famous temple in Tokyo, Sensoji. I knew I could have just used a map or my phone's GPS to get there, but I wanted to practice asking for directions. So I found a local convenience store and approached the cashier. "Excuse me," I began. "How do I get to Sensoji Temple?" The young man behind the counter looked a bit surprised, probably because he wasn't used to tourists asking for directions in English. But after a moment he smiled and said, "Ah, Sensoji. You go straight," and then left. He gestured with his hands, showing me the directions more clearly. "Thank you so much," I said, appreciating his effort to help me in English. I followed his directions and sure enough, I found the temple. As I stood in front of the beautiful red gate of Sensoji, I felt a sense of accomplishment. It wasn't just about reaching the destination. It was about the little victories along the way. Each conversation, each interaction, was another step toward improving my English skills and becoming more confident in my ability to communicate, even in unfamiliar situations. Joining a tour group. A few days later, I decided to join a guided tour of Mount Fuji. It was a chance to explore Japan's natural beauty and meet other travelers who might be English speakers. When I arrived at the meeting point, I was pleased to see that the guide was fluent in both Japanese and English, which made the tour much easier to follow. The group was made up of people from different countries, including a few fellow travelers from English-speaking countries like the United States and Australia. During the tour, we had plenty of time to chat as we made our way up the scenic route. I quickly fell into conversation with a couple from Canada, and we talked about our travel experiences. "You've been traveling a lot lately," one of them, Megan, said. "How's your English been holding up?" "It's been great," I replied, excited to share my experiences. I was in England before this, and now here in Japan, I'm using English even more than I expected. It's amazing how much you can learn just by talking to people. Megan nodded. "Yeah, it's incredible how much language learning can happen when you're thrown into real-life situations. It's not the same as sitting in a classroom." "Exactly," I agreed. "You just have to use what you know and figure the rest out as you go." Making new friends. One evening in Kyoto, I joined a language exchange event that I found online. It was a chance for locals who were learning English to practice with native and fluent speakers, and for travelers like me to learn a bit of Japanese. The group met at a cozy cafe, and I was paired with a Japanese student named Haruto, who was eager to improve his English. "Hi, nice to meet you," Haruto said with a slight accent, but his English was clear. "Nice to meet you too," I replied. "How long have you been learning English?" "About 3 years," he said, "but I don't get much chance to practice speaking." We spent the next hour chatting about our lives, our interests, and our experiences with learning languages. Haruto was curious about my trip to Japan, and I was equally curious about his experiences learning English in Japan. At one point, he asked, "What is the hardest part of learning English for you?" I thought for a moment before answering. Honestly, I think the hardest part was getting over my fear of speaking. I used to be really nervous about making mistakes, but traveling has helped me realize that mistakes are okay. They're just part of the learning process. Haruto nodded. Yes, I feel the same. Sometimes I'm afraid to speak because I don't want to sound stupid. Trust me, I said. You sound great. The fact that you're even having a conversation in English is impressive. The more you practice, the more confident you'll get. By the end of the night, I felt like I had made a new friend. Haruto thanked me for helping him with his English, and I thanked him for teaching me a few new Japanese phrases. It was another reminder that language is about more than just words. It's about connecting with people and sharing experiences.